Welcome to the debate. There is a mountain in Jerusalem that appears as a place of departure and, well, for many Christians, as a place of return.
Yeah, the final mountain.
Exactly. Today we are looking at the culmination of history. Why did the prophet Zechariah point to the Mount of Olives, a literal, physical piece of geography, as, ground zero for the end of the world?
Right, and it's a topic that brings up a lot of intense feelings.
It really does. We are exploring the text that serves as the editorial spine of today's discussion. We're looking at why so many Christians connect this exact mountain to the physical return of Christ. And we need to establish right away that exploring this text responsibly requires deep reverence and rigorous historical context.
Absolutely. We are leaving behind the fear-mongering, the panicked date-setting, all that sensationalism that has honestly hijacked this topic for decades.
Yeah, we're not doing that today. So my position in this debate is grounded in the principle of historical continuity. Zechariah's prophecies regarding the Messiah were fulfilled with exact, literal, geographical precision in the past.
Okay.
Because of that undeniable track record, I argue that his visions of the Mount of Olives splitting at the end of days, well, they should be understood as a literal future physical event.
Right, so you call it a literal blueprint, but look at the genre Zechariah is actually utilizing here. I approach this from the perspective that prophecy is not merely history written in advance.
Okay, then what is it?
It is theology painted on a vast cosmic canvas. While those historical connections you mentioned are undeniably profound, and I agree with you on them, Zechariah uses highly symbolic apocalyptic imagery. We're talking about visions of continuous daylight, human flesh dissolving, waters flowing in multiple directions simultaneously.
Very intense visuals, yeah.
Incredibly intense, and these are bold strokes intended to convey deep theological truths about divine judgment, grace, ultimate restoration. Reading this strictly as a geopolitical roadmap distorts the actual genre of the text.
Do you think it distorts it?
I do, yeah. When we force apocalyptic literature into a rigid, literalist box, we often generate the exact kind of fear-based speculation the text was originally meant to cure.
Well, if you want to talk about genre, I think we have to ground that genre in the exact historical reality Zechariah actually lived through.
Sure.
Because this wasn't some abstract philosophical exercise for him, right? Zechariah is a priest, he's a prophet, and he's writing around 520 BC.
Right after the exile.
Exactly. He is speaking to a post-exilic community. These are real people who have just survived the severe trauma of the Babylonian captivity. They've returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel, and they are standing in the middle of a destroyed city.
Trying to rebuild from nothing.
Rebuild a ruined temple, yeah. And they're surrounded by hostile neighbors. Now, in the middle of those literal physical ruins, Zechariah receives visions that map out the future with staggering specificity.
Okay, but
Wait, just look at the list. He prophesies a king arriving humbly on a donkey in chapter 9.
which Christians see as the triumphal entry.
Right. Then he predicts the precise price of a rejected shepherd, 30 pieces of silver, in chapter 11. He speaks of a shepherd whose side is pierced in chapter 12.
Yeah, the pierced one.
My point is, these were not ethereal metaphors meant to just stay in the clouds. Hundreds of years later, these events occurred in the physical world. A real donkey, real silver coins, a literal Roman spear.
Sure, I don't deny any of that.
So God didn't just abandon concrete reality for abstract poetry in the final chapter. Why would he suddenly switch gears?
Because the danger there is flattening the text. I don't deny the historical reality of the incarnation, obviously, or the crucifixion, but treating every single detail of Zechariah 14 with that same rigid literalism leads to absolute absurdities.
Absurdities? That's a strong word.
Well, let's look at it. If you read Zechariah 14 strictly literally, you have a river flowing perfectly to the eastern and western seas continuously through summer and winter. You have every single nation on earth migrating to Jerusalem annually.
Which would be geographically impossible under current conditions, yes.
Right. Apocalyptic literature pushes human language to its absolute breaking point to describe the indescribable reality of God.
But doesn't that...
Let me just finish this thought. Zechariah uses these explosive images to show God erasing the divide between the sacred and the secular, establishing his universal reign. It's about the magnitude of God's sovereignty over the cosmos, not a geology lesson about tectonic plates in the Middle East.
Okay, so if you're listening to this and wondering how two readers can look at the same ancient text and walk away with such wildly different expectations, it really comes down to a timeline problem.
Yeah, that's fair.
Specifically, how Zechariah structures his visions. During the Second Temple period, rabbinic scholars faced this massive theological dilemma. They were reading the prophets, and they saw two completely different, seemingly incompatible profiles of the Messiah.
The suffering servant versus the king.
Exactly. There was the Messiah, son of Joseph, the suffering, rejected servant who faces humiliation. And there was the Messiah, son of David, the conquering, glorious king who crushes his enemies. Zechariah provides the blueprint for both, and, amazingly, he often does it in the very same breath.
He does. And the way he contrasts that timeline should serve as a massive warning sign to any modern reader trying to drop a literal eschatological calendar.
A warning sign, how so?
Well, eschatology, being the theological study of the end of days, requires careful reading. Look at the mechanics of Zechariah 9. Verse 9 is that famous prophecy you mentioned. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. See your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey.
The humble servant.
Right, which was fulfilled historically. But read the very next sentence. Verse 10. Instantly the text says this same king will destroy the war chariots of Ephraim. Ephraim representing the northern kingdom's military might. He'll shatter the bow of battle and proclaim peace to the nations, ruling from sea to sea.
The glorious king.
But there is absolutely no transition. The text jumps from a peasant on a donkey to global dominion in a single comma. How can a responsible reader treat this as a literal chronological map when the prophet is clearly, collapsing time?
Well, this is where theologians apply what we call the mountain range analogy. And it perfectly explains that prophetic compression you're talking about.
The mountain range analogy? Right.
Yeah. Imagine you are a prophet, standing miles away, looking out toward the future as if you were looking at a vast mountain range.
Okay.
From your distant vantage point, you see two massive peaks. The first peak is the humble king on the donkey. The second peak is the global kingdom of peace. Now, because you are looking from a distance, those two peaks look like they are right next to each other.
They blend together. Right. They appear to be the exact same mountain. But as history marches forward and you actually hike into that terrain, you discover there is a massive valley of time separating those two peaks. Zechariah couldn't see the valley.
He just saw the peaks.
Exactly. But just because thousands of years separate the events in that valley, that doesn't make the second peak any less physically real than the first. The donkey was a physical animal. The global reign will be a physical reality too.
I hear you. The mountain range analogy works really well as a descriptive tool for prophetic foreshortening, but I think it ignores that the landscape itself actually changes.
What do you mean?
The valley isn't just a pause in the timeline. The nature of the peaks is fundamentally different. Think about it. The first peak, the humble king, was fulfilled historically in a single man on a single day.
Yes. The second peak, the global reign from sea to sea, uses cosmic, universal language that transcends physical geography entirely. It represents the ultimate, borderless scope of divine authority.
But why can't that also be literal?
Because when you insist that the second peak must be literal in the exact same way as the first, you completely ignore how the apocalyptic genre escalates. You're trying to measure a cosmic theological truth with a physical yardstick.
See, I would argue that using a physical yardstick is exactly what the text demands, especially when we look at the mechanics of the pierced one motif in Zechariah 12:10.
Ah, yes. Zechariah 12.
This is one of the most structurally audacious verses in the entire Hebrew Bible. The Lord, the God of Israel, is speaking, and he says, "They will look on me, whom they have pierced."
It's a shocking verse.
It is. The Hebrew phrase is Eli Asher Dakaru. God is speaking in the first person. The eternal, incorporeal creator of the universe says, "They pierced me."
For a Jewish reader in the Hellenistic period, that grammar was completely shocking. I mean, how can a spirit be physically pierced with a weapon?
Well, they struggled with it. The translators of the Septuagint, the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, they actually hit a wall with this exact verse.
They didn't know what to do with it.
No, they didn't. The theological weight of the eternal creator being physically pierced was so philosophically offensive to the Greek mind that they altered the text.
Right.
Instead of translating the word as pierced, they softened it. They translated it to mean mocked or danced around in triumph. They simply couldn't stomach the physical mechanism of a wounded deity.
Which honestly proves my point exactly. They softened it because the text unequivocally demanded a physical incarnation, and that terrified them.
But
And the New Testament maps this grammatical shock directly to the crucifixion. In John 19:37, when the Roman soldier drives a spear into Jesus' side to confirm he is dead, John explicitly cites Zechariah 12:10. It is undeniably physical. A literal Roman spear pierced literal human flesh.
yes, it did.
So if the prophecy demands the physical bodily piercing of God incarnate, which was the hardest possible thing for the ancient mind to accept, why would we assume the rest of the prophecy just dissolves into mere spiritual metaphor?
Because you cannot isolate the physical piercing from the theological purpose of that piercing. I don't deny the physical reality of the crucifixion, but the primary purpose of Zechariah 12 is not to give us a forensic account of Roman execution methods.
No, but the method matters.
It does, but look at the mechanism of what happens next. What is the result when they look upon the one they pierced? It doesn't trigger an immediate apocalyptic war?
No, it triggers mourning.
Right. Profound national mourning in Israel. The text says they will mourn like one mourning for an only son. Weeping family by family, tribe by tribe. The entire sociological structure of the nation is broken with grief.
Which aligns perfectly with the historical reality of a people eventually recognizing the Messiah they had previously rejected. I mean, the physical act creates the spiritual awakening.
Yes, but this proves the prophecy is fundamentally about grace, not violence. It's about deep repentance and spiritual restoration. I mean, the very next verse, chapter 13, verse 1, explicitly states that on that day a fountain will be opened for the house of David to cleanse them from sin and impurity.
A beautiful image. Yeah.
It is. The text takes this intense, violent image of a physical piercing and uses it to pivot directly into a narrative of profound spiritual cleansing. If you read this purely as a geopolitical checklist or some violent revenge narrative, you strip the grace entirely out of the text.
Okay, but if we accept that this grace is historically grounded, we run headfirst in the ultimate test to that theory, and that is Zechariah chapter 14.
The Mount of Olives chapter.
Exactly. You can't separate the physical piercing from the physical geography he introduces next. Zechariah 14 describes nations gathering against Jerusalem in a devastating conflict. And then, in verses 3 and 4, it says the Lord will go out and fight against those nations and here's the quote, "On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley."
A very vivid picture.
So as an investigator of this text, I have to press the central question. Why this specific mountain? It isn't Mount Zion where the temple stood.
Right.
It isn't Mount Sinai where the law was given. Why does the culmination of the world hinge on the Mount of Olives?
It is a deliberate and, frankly, fascinating choice of geography by the author.
It creates the ultimate narrative loop. Think about the New Testament echoes connected to this exact physical location. The Mount of Olives is where Jesus constantly retreated for silence and prayer. It's where he looked over Jerusalem and wept for the city's future. On its western slope is the Garden of Gethsemane, where he sweat blood in agony.
Right, leading up to the arrest.
Yeah. It's where he delivered the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, giving his disciples the signs of the end of the age. And most significantly in Acts chapter 1, this is the exact physical location from which Jesus ascended into heaven.
The ascension.
The disciples are standing on the Mount of Olives, watching him go, and two angels appear and say, "This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go. The prophecy of Zechariah gives us a perfect literal narrative of redemption. He left from the Mount of Olives, and Zechariah says his feet will physically touch down on the Mount of Olives. The geography anchors the promise.
Look, the symmetry of that narrative loop is beautiful, and I absolutely see the theological poetry in it.
But
But you cannot just cherry-pick the geography and ignore the surrounding apocalyptic language. Let's look at the actual text of Zechariah 14.
okay, let's do it.
Verses 6 and 7 describe a day with entirely unique atmospheric conditions, a day that is neither day nor night, but suddenly there is light at evening time. Then verse 12 describes a plague striking the invading armies, where their flesh consumes away while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes consume away in their sockets, their tongues rot in their mouth.
It's gruesome, yes.
Are we truly meant to read this as a literal meteorological forecast and a literal biological weapon? This is the language of apocalyptic terror. It is designed to visually overwhelm the reader, to communicate the inescapable reality of divine judgment.
Okay, but to say a description is apocalyptic doesn't automatically mean it isn't physical. The physical world can experience apocalyptic events.
To a degree.
I mean, we saw literal physical plagues in Egypt. We saw the physical sun darkened at the crucifixion.
Sure, but treating Zechariah 14 as a literal military and geological forecast leads to a very dangerous place. When we start reading this text like a crystal ball for Middle Eastern geopolitics, we open the door to the exact kind of fear-based spiritual manipulation that this debate is explicitly meant to avoid.
That's not what I'm advocating for, though.
I know, but people do it. They start looking at tectonic fault lines in the Jordan Rift Valley, or they read the news about global pandemics and biological warfare, and they panic. They think the eschatological clock has run out. Apocalyptic literature was designed by God to comfort the oppressed and challenge the comfortable. It was never meant to create a panic room mentality.
Right. I agree with that.
So by insisting on a hyperliteral reading of melting flesh and splitting mountains, you reduce a sweeping cosmic theological vision into a cheap horror movie.
Acknowledging that God intervenes in physical space and time shouldn't produce panic, though. It should produce awe. If God was precise about the exact 30 pieces of silver, why shouldn't he be precise about the mountain splitting?
Because the imagery shifts.
But the text explicitly states why the mountain splits. It splits to create a massive valley for the people to escape through. And the text specifically says they will flee just as they fled the earthquake in the days of Uzziah.
The historical earthquake?
Yes, a literal historical event. The mountain splits as a physical act of salvation, directly mirroring the parting of the Red Sea in the Exodus. God makes a literal way of escape in the physical world. I just think to over-spiritualize the Mount of Olives risks turning God's concrete historical acts of redemption into mere fables.
Well, there is a massive chasm between a fable and a literal geological rupture. The splitting of the mountain to create a valley of escape is a brilliant theological echo of the Exodus, precisely as you noted. Right. It communicates a profound truth. God makes a way where there is absolutely no way. But when we obsess over the tectonic plates of the Mount of Olives, we miss the theological weight of what God is actually doing. We miss the forest for the trees. The ultimate point of the prophecy isn't the destruction, it's what happens after.
You know, on that point, we actually have significant convergence.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, because both of our perspectives agree that the sensationalist, fear-mongering readings completely miss the ultimate goal of Zechariah's vision. The fearmongers who fixate on the melting flesh in verse 12 almost never keep reading to verse 16.
No, they don't.
And verse 16 throws a massive wrench into that fear-driven narrative.
It really does. It contains one of the most stunning, subversive moments of grace in the entire biblical canon.
Laid out for us.
After all the conflict, after the nations have gathered against Jerusalem and faced the reality of divine judgment, the text tells us what happens to the survivors. The survivors of those very same enemy nations will go up to Jerusalem year after year to worship the King, the Lord of armies, and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot.
Which is wild. You have surviving enemy armies suddenly traveling to Jerusalem as pilgrims.
Yeah,
It's a complete reversal of the ancient world's geopolitical expectations.
it is a breathtaking paradigm shift. I mean, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, was the ultimate festival of joy in the Jewish calendar. Historically, it commemorated the end of Israel's 40 years of wandering in the desert.
And agriculturally?
Agriculturally, it was the final harvest festival. Theologically, it anticipated the day God would dwell permanently with his humanity. And who was celebrating it in Zechariah 14? The Gentiles, the nations that just a few verses ago were invading enemies.
Wow.
The enemies have become worshipers. This is a story of radical grace and universal reconciliation. God's judgment in the prophets is almost never merely destructive, it is restorative. The ultimate vision is an inclusive, universal worship of the one true King.
So the goal of the prophecy isn't a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The goal is total sanctification.
Exactly.
And Zechariah drives this home in the final 2 verses of the entire book, verses 20 and 21. He says that the phrase, holy to the Lord, which, is the highly specific, sacred phrase that used to be engraved only on the pure gold plate worn on the high priest's forehead, he says that phrase will now be inscribed on the bells of ordinary horses.
Just incredible imagery.
He says the ordinary cooking pots in the Lord's house will be as sacred as the ceremonial bowls in front of the altar.
And that beautifully captures the profound theological symbolism of apocalyptic literature. The rigid divide between the sacred and the secular, which defined the entire Old Covenant system, is completely abolished.
Completely gone.
To put that in modern terms, it's the equivalent of saying the styrofoam coffee cups in your office break room are suddenly as holy as the golden chalice used by the Pope in the Vatican.
That's a great way to put it.
The categories collapse entirely because the presence of God is no longer contained.
The presence of the King sanctifies every inch of ordinary existence. You don't need a restricted temple zone anymore because God's holiness has flooded the mundane world.
Right. But, and this is exactly where I return to my core premise, that universal spiritual reality is triggered by a specific, physical event, the return of the King to the Mount of Olives. The physical validates the spiritual. The specific, historical fulfillment of the suffering servant on a donkey guarantees the specific, historical fulfillment of the conquering King on the mountain. And I still caution against locking the infinite God into a strictly physical mechanism. Yes, the ultimate reality is God's holy presence sanctifying the ordinary pots and pans of our lives, but the text is painting a cosmic portrait of restoration. It demands we look past the geography, past the ancient Near Eastern warfare imagery, to actually see the grace. When we reduce Zechariah 14 to a future news headline, we strip it of its mystery and its power. Well, as we bring this debate to a close,
My position remains firm. The breathtaking specificity of Zechariah's first coming prophecies justifies reading the Mount of Olives' eschatological role as a concrete geographical promise of Christ's physical return. History has shown us that when God promises a donkey, he provides a donkey. When he promises a mountain, we should expect a mountain.
and I maintain that the rich apocalyptic imagery in these final chapters demands we look beyond physical descriptions to the ultimate theological reality. We are witnessing a cosmic shift from judgment to universal grace. To reduce the magnitude of God's timing and power to an earthly calendar or a localized geological event is to miss the majesty of the text entirely.
We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence of literal precision against the profound depths of symbolic theology. But there is a crucial educational takeaway that we both agree on. Zechariah is powerful not because it gives you a countdown to the end of the world.
It doesn't.
No.
It is powerful because it forces us to wrestle with the heavy realities of judgment, the enduring nature of hope, the kingship of Christ, and the mystery of God's future. True prophetic study should cultivate reverence, deep historical context, and sharp discernment. It should never be used as a tool to incite panic or manipulate behavior through fear.
There is a mountain in Jerusalem that appears as a place of departure and for many Christians as a place of return. But whether you see that final mountain as a literal point on a map or a profound theological symbol, its ultimate purpose is to anchor our hope in the King who restores all things. Keep exploring the text, keep seeking the context, and keep asking the hard questions.